Hello guys, good day. So I am Curtis L. Dizon and I am your substitute instructor for Social 1. So Ma'am Nahavila take her medical leave, so I'll be taking over for the meanwhile. So it's a good thing that Ma'am Nahavila already posted your main materials, which would include the PowerPoint presentation for the midterms and as well video lectures. So please take note that her PowerPoint presentation and her video lectures are the main material. So those would be the source when it comes to your activities and especially for your midterm examination. Now, since I'll be taking for the meanwhile, it is as well good that I'll be providing supplemental video lectures. Now, please take note that these are just supplemental video lectures that will now add or provide additional knowledge when it comes to culture and socialization. But again, may I emphasize again and again that the main materials will still be coming from Ma'am Nahavila. So my task, or rather what we will be discussing for finals, rather in midterms, would now be culture and socialization. So basically, I just recycled my PowerPoint presentation when I was still teaching during the senior high. Why? Social one was in the new curriculum was bring down was transferred to the senior high with the course title Understanding Culture, Society, and Politics, wherein we also discuss the same lessons way back on Social 1. You are part of the old curriculum, so Social 1 will also discuss culture, socialization, deviance, and the rest. Excuse me. Now, first we have to look into the subject matter. So for your midterms, we'll be discussing all about culture. So basically, you already have an idea what is culture. So one would now think or visualize when they hear the word culture, they will immediately think about indigenous tribes. They will now talk about clothing. All of those are the same. And the things that we think about culture basically are covered by this definition. Culture in its simplest definition, is a way of life. Everything that people create, this would now include your values. Your value systems would now include yung po and opo. Kaya madalas siyang nadidiscuss when we talk about culture. Your norms. So when we talk about norms, these are the similar behavior that a group of people would now express. So norms would now include, for instance, in a classroom, the norm would now be in a senior high classroom, for instance, everybody will be wearing a uniform and basically goals. Now, generally speaking, culture develop as people interact with one another over time. So from our subject, sociology, sociology pertains to the study of society. So we look into one element of society, which is now culture. So with the interaction of human beings, di ba, in society, in sociology, we look now into the interconnection of human beings to his fellow human beings. So from that interaction, may nade-develop ng culture. It's the hallmark of human species. Distinguish man from animals. Animals, do they have culture? Basically, there might be arguments from biologists, pero we could now distinct that humans have created this culture. So that's it. Now, what is culture? In its formal definition, culture is a composite or multifarious areas that comprise beliefs, practices, excuse me, values, attitudes, laws, norms, artifacts, symbols, knowledge, and everything that a person learns and share as a member of society. Now, please take note of the things that were enumerated from beliefs up to knowledge and also everything. Now, this would now comprise later your elements of a culture. So for instance, would now be belief. For instance, spiritual or religious belief could now manifest culture. Our practices, your practices, for instance, in your communities, your festivities, your values, what do people believe, your attitude. When we talk about attitude, that is within our mind. Laws. So this would now include laws in the government or even laws in your house, diba? In your household, in your family, your norms, your common behavior patterns, artifacts. This will now include materials, your clothing, for instance, indigenous clothing or cloth. Symbols. Symbols would now include, for instance, paintings within our room. So, for instance, when you try to check symbols in terms of genres, hip hop culture would now magnify graffitis, while on rock it would be purely be capitalized by the color black. Knowledge and everything that a person learns. So we'll be enumerating that sooner or later, or within the succeeding slides. Now, characteristics of culture. Now, this came from Palispis. So Palispis elaborated or enumerated the following characteristics. It's a product of human interaction. So basically, within a classroom, so for instance, in blocks, in college blocks or sections. So within a section, within the interaction of your fellow classmates, for instance, there will now be a culture that is being developed within the section. So, for instance, section A, the culture of section A might differ from section 1. So it's a product of human interaction within your family. So you have your parents, your father and your mother, or for instance, because family has been defined uh, differently especially in our times, so pwede din siyang father and father, mother, rather two males, for instance, like that. So within those interaction between the members of the family, we now create those culture, a social heritage that is complex and socially transmitted. So more likely culture is being transmitted. So for instance, in terms of clans, it has been generated through generations. Or for instance, would now be in terms of your school. Being a Louisian, for instance, you will know identify culture because it has been passed through generations to generations. Provide socially patterns for meeting biological and social needs. Now, to give you an idea, for instance, would now be the culture here in the mountains is different from the culture from the lowlands because it has been determined by, may add something to the third bullet form, would be in terms of geographical terrains, diba? So it's difficult to meet your needs, for instance, in the high regions, in the highland regions, because of the scarce of resourcity. Unlike with the low regions, more likely is that they generated their culture differently. Although, just to provide something to say on the third bullet form, a distinguished factor. So when you try to recognize an individual or a group of individual, you could now identify that person, the group of that person, by checking his culture. So for instance, the way he speak, linguistics. Linguistic is one essential feature of culture. So you could now determine, oh, this individual belongs to that certain type of group. An established pattern of behavior. So behavior is something that is external. That would now include our actions, our expression. So something that we express within our mind, then we express it, it now becomes culture. So that's the definition of behavior. Cumulative, so means naiipon siya. And meaningful to human beings. Culture has values. Okay, so there are types of culture. We could now categorize them into two, wherein we have non-material culture. So basically, non-material is basically they are not tangible, but we could observe them. So an example of this one would be ideas. So your knowledge. In the Cordilleras, for instance, we have your indigenous knowledge systems. So within these indigenous knowledge systems, so these are practices or beliefs, behavior, gestures, and habits. So an example of this one would now be, in terms of habits, would now be the habit within your classroom. So within your classroom, we have these habits like um, what else? Playing chess, di ba? Madami. You could provide a lot. Or more likely when it comes to religion, di ba, your gestures. In Islamic faith, di ba, it's a gesture in to present good faith is presenting your right index finger, because this would now symbolizes uh, Allah, di ba? In Islamic faith, yung index finger, when they do like this, presents that the principle of the Islamic faith, which is now monotheism, di ba? That Allah is one, or in Arabic we call it as Tawhid. Religion. Oh, yun, nasabi ko na din, no? You could now check the culture of an individual by basing it in terms of his religion. So we could now check the behaviors, kunyari ng mga Iglesia ni Cristo, that would now include they forbid their members to eat blood. Or for instance, your Muslims, diba? The clothing, their gestures, diba? The clothing could be recognized. And language and symbols. So language is one very evident type of culture. So basically, when you see a person, you could now check his clothing automatically, pwede na yan. But you could now validate it by looking into the way he speak, no? So you could now distinguish, for instance, an Ilocano from a Highlander, diba? An Ibaloy. Now, in the highlands, you could now distinguish an Iboloy and a Kalanguya or Kangkanae. Or for instance, in urban culture, for instance, we could now distinguish people who belong to the R&B, who likes acoustics, from those who are hip hop. Sabi nga nila, you understand that person likes hip hop if that person speaks a little bit aggressive. Then there are slangs or jargons, cultural jargons and symbols, di ba? Yan. Now, the second type of culture, which we could also distinguish, would now be in terms of material culture. So, for instance, food. One determinant of culture will always be food. So, you could now distinguish, for instance, Filipino food. Alam na natin yan, adobo, etc. There are a lot of spices. But speaking about spices, we have your Middle Eastern countries. You know? So, curry. In Japan, we could now determine they like fish and rice. Diba? In the United States or in Western countries, their their food would now include staple food would now include bread, diba? We have spaghetti, Italians. Fashion and accessories. This is actually I'm stating a while ago. So we have t-shirts, diba? Millennials, Gen Zs would now wear t-shirts, right? While more likely your oldies would now wear polo shirts. But within the t-shirts, for instance, we could now consider that their taste of music. And music is also a determinant of culture. Now, from a very anthropological point of view, we could also check, for instance, differentiate from accord-11, diba? The weavings. Labeling would always be the wanges, diba? The G-strings. From the Tagalogs, we have the Barong Tagalog. Then from the Muslims, we have their Muslim attires, diba? For the females, for instance, we have the hajib. Architectural structure. Now, architectural structure would now include, for instance, you could now determine Filipino structure. Para siyang bahay kubo, no? Excuse me. Now, yung bahay kubo, di ba? Which is being manifested in a lot of our government projects, government buildings, infrastructures, to be exact. For instance, we also see, so if you are in the architecture structure, di ba? More likely if you want to present nationalistic features, then more likely dapat ano yan, based yan sa bahay kubo. We could now distinguish as well Islamic architectural structures, di ba, may curve. We could now distinguish Oriental, similar with the Chinese, the Japanese, and we could now distinguish, for instance, Europeans and Americans. So European, kunyari, if you know the brutalist structure, di ba? It's purely concrete. I find it so beautiful. And lastly is technological tools. So for instance, technological tools, diba? Technology is something that would now assist human labor. So for instance, would now be knives, no, or swords. So when you try to check, maganda sana kung may picture, but I just recycle this one. Swords from Japan, diba? They use the katana. Looking into the design of the sword, you will now check, oh, that is Japanese. Then you will now check on the sword of the Americans or from the French. Yung medyo pahaba siya, no? Oh, that's European. From your Middle Eastern, medyo may pa-curve siya. Then from the Filipinos, we have the kris, pa-curve, and the bolo. So you know, so basically everything that we see is basically it manifests culture. Now, please take note for this one. We assume that our own culture is normal or natural, but in fact, it is not natural. Culture is learned. So later in our discussion on socialization, where do we learn our culture? So we look into the agents of socialization. These are external factors. So for instance, we first learn culture within our family, the ones who mold us, who we grew with, no? So our father, mother, basically that would now be the main source of our culture. But hindi lang nakalimit sa family, basically the one who we grew up with. So basically, I'm sorry if this is a sensitive statement or story, kunyari na you are being adopted or iba yung napalaki sa'yo. So yung nagpalaki sa'yo, doon mo natutunan yung culture. But hindi lang sa family. So culture is also learned from the school. Ito yung sinasabi ko, ano no, the way we speak, 'di ba? Although wala sa types of culture, 'di ba? The way we speak. Ayan pala language. Yan. The way we speak, for instance. So the way we speak, for instance, my family is very, they do not tolerate swears, they do not tolerate foul language, and that is true. However, I learned to speak bad words when I was in school, di ba? You could learn it from your teacher, not basically the teacher, but it could be, di ba? Certain times. But basically, you could now learn it from your classmates or your friends, your peer groups, di ba? So, as well, aside from language, you could now also develop or learn the way you where you fashion, di ba? Ay, where you fashion the things on how the clothing, the music, it penetrates our lives so deeply that it is taken for granted and provided the lens through which we evaluate things. So culture provides a taken for granted orientation to life. Now, something about culture. Culture is symbolic. So components of symbolic culture. First, we have to define a symbol. A symbol is something to which people attach meaning and that people use to communicate. Sorry. So when we talk about symbol, yan, there's a meaning, there's a value. And it is used to communicate. So for instance, symbols would now include language. Kasi language, for instance, in every word that I'm articulating, or rather in every symbols that I'm articulating, we now provide meanings. So for instance, pst, diba? From those sounds alone, pst, it means you're getting attention. You're now making attention. Basta gumagawa ka na attention sa isang tao, diba? Yung from the words pst, pst, uy, diba? Again, those are words, diba? And that would now form language, and they have certain meanings. We provide meanings from these sounds like uy, diba? Or pst, ganon, scoot, diba? All those words may meaning, diba? And those meanings will now be the reason, or rather the way on how people will now communicate. Now from those very simple words na ginamit ko kanina, sounds rather, then to more complicated sounds such as I'm speaking right now, di ba, nagiging complicated na sounds, doon nagkakaroon ngayon ng meaning yung tao. And it is used to communicate. And again, that is a component of culture. From your gestures, kanina is verbal. Now, right now is non-verbal, no? So speak about non-verbal like this, gestures. Non-verbal would now include gestures, hand symbols, for instance, diba? Like this would now signify, every people knows this, stop, diba? Again, that is symbolic culture. From this one, yung sinabi ko kanina sa Muslims, or your middle finger, diba? Middle finger presents a negative connotation, diba? And, you know, we are looking into culture. All cultures will now determine the symbol behind the middle finger, diba? It's something that is negative. Well, in fact, when we do like this, or like this, or like this, totally wala namang meaning. It's people who now attach meaning. And it is used to communicate. And again, that is the product of the human mind, di ba? Napakagaling. Although, yun ang ganda, no? Values, di ba? Your norms, sanction, folkways. From your language, gestures, palaki na siya ng palaki. Di ba? Yan. Kaya nagiging symbolic yung culture natin. Again, a while ago, I stated, gestures using one body to communicate with others are shorthand means of communication. So, you know, hand gestures, tone of voice, di ba? Yung mga sinasabi ko kanina, and body actions. So, those are basically yung how we initiate culture. And also, I also mentioned about language. Actually, nasabi ko na siya, no? From a very simple sound, generation of sound, to more complicated or abstract, or rather complicated sounds, nagkakaroon tayo ng more abstract meaning towards those things. Now, when we hear about culture, ito ang lagi natin tandaan. Nasabi ko yung types as well, you must also remember the elements. So for instance, there are 8, but in various sources, napakadaming elements ng culture. But basically, here are the very common, no? So first would now be customs. So when we define custom, it is a right or usual way which is not written, and it is practiced since a long time. A custom is more about practices. So for instance, no, kanyaw, di ba? So kanyaw is a Cordilleran practice here in the Cordillera, obviously, no. So kanyaw is basically paano ba Tagalog to? Butchering of pigs, no? And there would now be dances, no? So, Kanyaw is celebrated usually for wedding practices, birthdays, or even in funeral, no? So again, that is a custom and religious practice as well, no? And when we talk about religious practice, yun, nakalagay dito, practice. Catholic feast. Seldomly hindi na natin 'to ginagawa, no? Honestly speaking, 'di ba? But during your olden times, napapractice pa rin siya, no? So, oh, no, no, no. May I rephrase this one. Kung yung Santo Niño, 'di ba? That is a Catholic feast and is still currently practiced. Yan. Circumcision rather, was derived from religious and later health reasons. So religious, more likely nagpauso niyan would now be the Jews. It would now signify cleanliness and purity. And in health reasons, particularly this has been promoted to deter, if that is the appropriate term, or one way in order to avoid HIV. Now, I hope you're all mature. Ang argument kasi dito is once the males are being circumcised, there will not be may ma-develop na foreskin, or rather a more additional barrier dun sa gland ng lalaki. So basically, 'di ba, the problem kasi when it comes to sexual activities is that possibility pwede magkaroon ng cuts between your genitals at doon papasok yung ating virus. Now, ang suggestion dito kasi sa circumcision is more likely how to say this, na magkakaroon na additional protection yung skin, or it's not kalyo, parang ganun yung ano, pero magkakaroon ng skin, no? So it gives you additional protection. Then gang initiation, no? So again, that is a practice, no? So for instance, gang initiation, I know you're teenagers, hindi na siya uso ngayon. But for instance, gang initiation or fraternity initiations, so you could now recognize yourself in fraternities, di ba? Fraternities have their own culture. So that has been a practice, di ba? Number two would now be knowledge or information skills. So these are education and experiences. So for instance, in the Cordillera region, we have the indigenous forest management, which is very nice. When you try to check, indigenous tribes here in the Cordillera have a way, a knowledge on how to preserve the forest. So more likely there is a little bit of superstition, but again, it's been effective and it is being used by your local government units and by especially departments, including your NCIP and your DNR. So we have the example of this. We have the Lapat, which is in Abra, practiced by the Isneg, the Muyong, practiced by the Ifugaos, and the Tayan, practiced by your Bontok tribe, no? So basically, ang dami yan, no? So they stated that once they, for instance, in the Isneg, they will now impose lapat on that certain area. People would not are forbidden to enter that area. Pag papasok sila dyan, there will now be curses, there will now be bad omens. And a good thing about this one, aside from its spiritual meaning, is that they will now preserve the ecosystem within that area that they have now imposed lapat. Code of silence of the mafia, that is again knowledge, no? Or gangsters, diba? Oracles by your elders, again, those are knowledge. Now, present day, code of silence of the mafia, pwede din yan, or yung gangs natin, diba? Number three, symbols rather, or arts. They represent or stand for something. And basically, it is manifested in material culture. They are products of human imagination. So for instance, this, di ba? In Bontok, we have the Chaklag. We have Wangod, di ba? The last mambatok of Kalinga, di ba? Again, that is art manifested by human imagination. And again, going back to symbolic culture, it would now manifest their culture, no? May value yan, no? So for instance, Kalinga women, the more tattoos you have, the more beautiful you are, di ba? And exactly yung napakaganda ni Wangod. Then we have the Chaklag, di ba? It represents for the males, di ba? Numerous sources, Dr. Brett would now provide that males who have tattoos are earned. Speak about tattoos are earned, kunyari you have to committed in headhunting activities to earn a tattoo. And yun yung argument kasi pagdating dito sa tattoos, no, yung tattoo ngayon, it's seen as a commodity na bibili na lang. Unlike during their age, during their generation, their tattoo is earned, di ba? However, that is the bad thing about modernity, no? We have graffitis, di ba? So, for instance, modern societies, us, our generation, would now present our culture through graffiti, and it is associated with urban culture, di ba? Hip-hop. Then ito, Sarimanok, di ba? So speaking about Sarimanok, it represents an ethno and religious meaning. So more likely common siya sa Mindanao. Also, we have language, na-mention ko na yan. And please take note to add, language is the cornerstone of culture. Yan, basically, when we identify individuals, aside from sex, we also identify them in terms of their ethno-linguistics. Yung argument niya daw dito, don't just state ethnic tribes, no? We identify them by their ethno-linguistic. Yun yung sabi ng isang sociologist, nakalimutan ko na yung pangalan. Pero maganda yung argument niya. Fifth, beliefs. Speak about the belief, it's more likely religion. Example, religion, diba? Your myth and your superstition. So we have Roman Catholics, Muslims, and from belief as well, it would now determine as well their language, diba? Religion kasi sa Roman Catholics may na-incorporate na Latin and Greek. More likely is Orthodoxy yun. Then for the Muslims, Muslim Mindanao, yung kanilang ethno-linguistic their ethnic language, may na-influence na din na Arabic. And from their superstition. Norms, please take note na, norms, rules that govern our lives and values, expectation, rules, and behavior. Now, one definition of norms that we must remember, norms are socially accepted and shared behavior. So for instance of a shared behavior would now be pag may nakita kang, rather, in a crossing, traffic crossing, no? So road crossing, diba? Pag nag-red yung ilaw, everybody would now stop. So everybody, you shared that behavior na nag-stop kayo. That is considered to be a norm. Or for instance, during your high school, diba? During your high school, ang nangyari nun kasi sa high school is pinapa-uniform tayo. We wear our uniform, therefore that is a shared behavior. Now that is a norm. And later sa discussion natin sa deviance, an example of when we violate a norm, ang tawag natin doon would now be deviance. So, lahat kayo nagsuot ng uniform, yung isa nakahubad or basically nakasando, and basically that is a deviant activity because he now violate that norm. Yan. So, ano to? Okay, belief, di ba? We have your religions, your anitos, then your language, di ba? Ang tawag natin dito is now your baybayin. Hindi siya alibata because the National Historical Commission already what is the term? Conclude, pero may mas appropriate yan na hindi alibata. Ang argument, ang reason daw kasi, may isa daw teacher, ang term na alibata, it came from the first two Arabic alphabet, yung Ali and Bata. Kasi it very looks like Arabic, no? Although na-influence tayo ng mga Arabs, no? Especially on the south. Yan, example of norms violation, walk around the mall with an open umbrella, di ba? Magiging weirdo ka, and that is deviant, no? Talking to yourself in public. Right now, I'm talking by myself. But basically, is it deviant? No. Wala akong masabi. Driving on the wrong side, okay? So you do not share the same behavior that other people do. Saying goodbye when you answer the phone. Have an animated conversation with yourself in public. So yung kanina yung talking and public. So virtual space is already a public space, no? Yan, yung Zoom meeting natin, yung Google Classroom. Talk to strangers, female. It's a big no-no. Eat soup with a fork. Yan. So here are the following elements to continue. No, so we have values and morals. So when we talk about values, so more likely it has something to do with morality. So morality came from the word mores. So special folkways which are important to the welfare of the people and their cherished values. So more likely when we talk about morals kasi, it's basically knowing what is good and bad. And it signifies value. So for instance, would now be superstition. In the Cordilleras, we have this term called inayan, di ba? So when we talk about inayan, it's like a taboo na kung gagawin mo to na bawal, tendency to now curse you and also your families. As well, taboos would now include shouting, committing certain deviant activities. You're inside the church, then you will now be shouting. So that is a violation of your values and your mores, di ba? Or especially in religion, di ba? Doing bad things within the church. Or in Muslim, we call it as haram. Number 8, folkways. So general rules, customary, and habitual ways followed without much thought given to the matter. Not morally significant. So very similar siya actually sa customs. To give an example, no? Okay, so for instance, we have the custom, diba? Who will now dictate the mores of the society? So for instance, in Cordilleran societies, more likely this is from Bontoc. And as well in Kankanay, diba? You commonly see this, no? To those who visit who are from the mountain province. Ang tawag natin dito is the tapay. It's a political institution where elders will now meet and they will now form that tapay, which is basically has two meanings. First is the place, and second, it would now be the people, the institution. And more likely, when we talk about institution, kasi it would now include the institution itself, the place, and the members, the individual, the human beings involved. So they will now dictate the laws and the norms of the community. Ito yung dapay, no? Another instance when it comes to Morse and folkway would now be yung po and opo. Yung ano po. So actually, ito, po and opo was derived from Spaniards. However, may argument yan eh. The known origin kung saan tayo nakuha natin yung po and opo are not basically coming from na-introduce yan ng Spaniards. Some would now assume sa mga Chinese. But the center source kung saan daw nagsimula to would now be from ancient Persian. We call it as ang tawag doon, nasukta ko lang kanina eh. Ay, yung forgot. Okay, regardless to say, ayoko nang ulitin yung video. Nakuha siya dati na mga sa ancient Persia, and it has been used by the Greeks. Proxenesis yata yun. Ito yung naging argument kaya nagkaroon ng little bit coup nung time ni Alexander the Great. So nakita ni Alexander the Great ang ganda ng practice nitong mga Persians, so kinuha niya. And there are some generals who argue na ang pangit ng ganyang system. Kasi it connotes royalty, di ba? From your Shah, from your emperors. Yan. Then also, another type of folkway would now be this during your funerals, di ba? Wherein we have toddlers or kids, wherein pag may namatay na relative, kailangan i-ganon-ganon in order to avoid certain taboos or omens within the family. Yan, speaking about taboos, you know. So norms that are, rather, it's not a taboo, curse rather. Yan. Number 9 would now be taboo, na nagka-miss numbers. Norms that are so strongly ingrained that even thought of them is greeted with revulsion. Cannibalism. More likely, this is in terms of Western civilizations, no? However, when we try to check on other islands, especially on the Pacific, there are notions now that they committed cannibalism. Incest. So incest, speaking about you having a sexual affair with your relative. Then necrophilia. So those are taboos. Element of culture din yan. Laws. Now, laws is important, no, for us political science, for me pala, no? Formalized norms formulated by a governing body. So there are norms na hindi naman siya codified, hindi naman siya sinusulat. Now, laws is basically sinusulat natin na norms. And later, may political will yan. It is a system of rules that are enforced through social institutions to govern behavior. Now, the best example will now be the government. Yan. In order to control yung ano natin. Makikita natin yan later sa socialization. And laws, when you avoid following laws, or when you, nakalimutan ko nun. Yan, yung laws will now be sanctioned. These are ways and means of rewards and punishment adhering to a norm. So for instance, in the mafia, di ba? The mafia has a very nice type of knowledge. So it's usually hidden, not hidden, secret. Secret yung kanilang ano. They follow the principle of secrecy. When you try to check on the structure of the mafia, Italian mafia to be exact, is that they have their codes, their norms, how they should now behave. They also adhere to laws. They also adhere to the authorities. Now, speaking about sanction, di ba? If you violated, yung nasasabihin ko sana sa laws kanina, if they have violated, for instance, one conduct of being a member of the mafia, there are following sanctions. For instance, your Game of Thrones as well. To those who watch Game of Thrones, tendency, di ba? Nakita natin yung sanctions. Yan, di ba? This guy he violated rather one of the rules of the Night's Watch, di ba? That hindi dapat siya escape dun sa kanyang watch. So the sanction, punishment, will now be death. So example of the content when we use the elements of culture, the Bontoc tribe. So the art, daming art yan, no? So for instance, we have the chaklag, the tattooed chest of the head taker. Yan. Pong-o, the tattooed arms of men and women, then patok for all the tattoos of both sexes. Pero hindi lang tayo nakalimit sa tattoos, ha? For instance, we could also check their clothing, yung wangas natin, no? The language is Bontoc. So more likely they capitalize on FUV, di ba? Not to degrade, no? Yung mga ganun yung accent nila eh. Knowledge, Tayan, corporate property, indigenous forest management. We also could include yung DAPI system, their political institution. Their belief, We could also extract it from their olden beliefs, no? Say they believe to lumawig, the bontok god and culture hero. So may myth din yan, no? And right now they have been practicing, they have been Christianized by basically both your Spaniards, although malit lang yung penetration ng mga Spaniards sa loob ng Bontoc region, which were then been subjugated to American missionaries, lalo na Anglican. But Anglican, more likely, nag-focus yan sa, sa Sagada. Customs and art, yan, dinagdag ko ulit yan. We have the gang sapatong, yan, similar with the Kanyao. Actually, Kanyao din yan. Headhunting trips, more likely this is to historical, no, Saab and Chono. And currently we still have the pispak, no, the budong, no, and the pagta, the pispak holder. So when I recorded this last week, may tribal war between Kalinga and Bontong, and it is actually happening right now, no. Although there are initiatives conducted by our government, specifically the local and regional agencies, no, in order to ensure peace, lalo na sa Kalinga, no, because currently, again, that is another example of culture. Tribal war still exists, no. Ba't ko sinama to? Okay, regardless to say, maganda din isama to because I love hip-hop. It's not to signify any deviant activity. But again, wala naman deviant actually dito, no? Because it manifests culture, no? So, for instance, the way they... before that one, we have Mexicans, no? So, we have Mexican gangs. So, this would now include Sureños, or prison gangs that would now include your Mexican prison gangs such as your La Eme or your Mexican mafia. So looking from kunyari yung mga tattoos alone, you could now signify this is more likely in terms of criminal sociology, no. Madalas siyang ginagamit sa United States. For instance, the tattoos. When you see this one, may 13, 'di ba? This is si MC Pancho, this is si Troublesome, no. Si Tiggs, RFA Tiggs, tapos to si, I'm saying that one, no? Kasi when you try to check, no, if you try to check, nandito yung mga chapters nila, harbor area. This is more likely, ano yung tattoo ni ano dito, nakalimutan. But when you try to check 13, so you could now recognize he's affiliated with the Mexican mafia. As well with their clothes, diba? The clothes would now signify their genre when it comes to music. So hip-hop, no? But when you try to check, no, ano pang signify ano nila dito? Yan. Cortez shoes, 'di ba? It was been designed by Mr. Cartoon. Yan, 'di ba? And Cortez shoes represents the creativity of the Mexican thing, no? Yan. So makikita mo, no, from the tattoos alone, makikita mo, Mexicano yan, no? Yan, no? I'm stating a while ago, Latino hip-hop culture. Tattoos, 'di ba? Tattoos would now include Mama Mary, specifically the Lady of Guadalupe. So, from medyo not indigenous, yung medyo traditional conservative culture, they now reflect it towards or nag-fuse yung kultura nila. Yung nag-fuse yung traditional, which is their conservative beliefs, their religion belief, up to the present, yung tattoos, no? And Old English font calligraphy, common siya sa hip-hop, no? Sa Latinos, no? So, for instance, graffitis as well. So, when we speak about graffitis, Latino gangs tag their surf according to their gangs cliques to remark their territories. Now, law enforcers in United States, California, for instance, will now check, no, kasi territorial dispute din yung mga gangs yan, eh. So they will now mark, kunyari 13 Sureños, 'di ba? Crips, they will now use spray paints that would now recognize that you are in an area surrounded by your Sureños. Their fashion, more likely double XL tees with baggy pants, 'di ba? Then we have your Levi's. Yan. Then their knowledge. You will now check, no, these are simple street gangs, however, napaka-organized yung ating mga street gangs. They have their constitutions, their slangs. Snitches get stitches. Snitches basically states that kung nagsumbong ka sa police, you get stitches. You get, that is one sanction. 1% or 1% signifies that you're only the 1% who do not follow the society, di ba? Society norms, rules. Hierarchy of gang authorities, di ba? We also have your their terms, no? OGs, original gangsters, veteranos, jefe, shot callers, cholo, soldado, gero. Belief, nasabi ko na yan. Customs, gang initiation, di ba? They have their own handshakes, di ba? In fraternities, lalo, we have our own handshakes na hindi dapat ipapakita sa ibang tao, di ba? When we speak about fraternities, yun, gang initiation din yan, Cinco de Mayo, etc. Languages, di ba? They use words, slangs, such as ese, carnal, cabron, and the rest. Now, speak about culture. When we compare, or rather the attitude when it comes to culture, there are two things, no? So we have ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. Ano nga ba ito? Now, we must recognize that hindi uniform yung culture natin. Culture is diverse, culture is different, no? In society. So may kultura tayo sa iba't ibang ano, no? So yung kultura mo sa family, iba din yung kultura ng family ng isang kakilala mo. And we must recognize this one. However, it also leads that you're now thinking na mas nagiging dominant yung kultura natin. And that is something that this PowerPoint is now portraying. So a consequence of internalizing culture is ethnocentrism. Ano nga ba itong ethnocentrism? Using our own culture and assuming it to be good, right, and superior to judge other cultures. And this is happening. So for instance, what is happening would now be, this is my own culture. I belong in this social group. Let us say hip-hop. Music muna tayo, no? So me as a hip-hop, I think that those who listen to rock, who listen to R&B are way too inferior. So that is an example of ethnocentrism. Or another example would now be schools. I am a Louisian. You now identify yourself within that social group. And that social group has already its own culture kasi it's a product of interaction, di ba? So I am a Louisian, then an ethnocentric attitude would now imply that I think that those who belong from Ateneo, from De La Salle, from UP are inferior. Yun yung ethnocentrism. Anong attitude ba dito? May tinatawag tayo na in-group eh. Yan, in-group. That in-group attitude, since you belong to that group, you belong to that social group, you think na superior ka na eh. And that manifests ethnocentrism. Now, just to read, ethnocentrism is functional when it creates in-group solidarity, but can be dysfunctional if it leads to harmful discrimination. And the best example of ethnocentrism, na hindi ko pa na-provide nung una, would not be in terms of ethnicity. From the word ethno, no? So this has been manifest by Hitler, for instance, di ba? Hitler stated that the Aryan race, the German people, are the superior race of the whole world, no? So he stated in his Mein Kampf na we will now dominate the world, and other ethnic tribes, other races such as Jews, your Negroes, your Slavics yung mga taga-Russia, are inferior, di ba? So those are example of your ethnocentrism. The best example always will be races. Pero hindi lang siya nagfo-focus sa race. It will not be focusing, for instance, in your culture, diba, yung general type natin. That is also ethnocentrism. Cultural relativism, on the other hand, is quite different. Consists of trying to appreciate other groups' way of life in the context in which they exist without judging them as superior or inferior to our own. Now, when we talk about cultural relativism, you acknowledge that there's a diversity when it comes to culture. And you do not judge them negatively. And you do not compare them that they are inferior compared to your own culture. Yan. So when we talk about hierarchy of culture, ganito yan, no? So there's a main culture, then there will always be subcultures. So to give you an example na lang, I know you would read the PowerPoint, is that, for instance, no, we could now state that we have the Filipino culture. How do we define Filipino culture? We speak Tagalog, quote-unquote Tagalog, diba? We have our own entertainment, diba? We love ABS, we have GMA, etc. Those are common. Pero within the Filipino culture, you are being divided into subcultures. So yung kultura na Ilocano ay iba sa kultura na Igorot. Pero under siya dun sa labeling natin na Filipino culture. Now from the Ilocano, pwede din ma-divide yan. Region 1, Region 2 from provinces. Same as with the Cordilleran culture. You can now differentiate Ibaloy culture from Kankanai culture from the Kalinga culture. So each subculture is a world within the larger world of dominant culture. So nahahati yan. Yan. There are also what we call as countercultures. So they are in opposition rather, to the dominant culture. So more likely ito yung lumalabas, no? May I go to number 2. Countercultures are usually associated with negative behavior. For example, heavy metal so glorifies Satanism, hatred, cruelty, rebellion, or sexism, violence, and death are example of a counterculture for many people. Now, ano yung dominant culture natin? Kunyari, we're just simple individuals, diba? Pero may papasok kunyari may heavy metal fans, diba? Abnoy, diba? Sasabihin natin. Just to provide an example, diba? Uy, abnoy, weirdo, diba? It manifests deviance, diba? And again, that is counterculture. It also is closely associated with the term deviance, diba? Often feeling threatened by counterculture, members of the broader culture may move against the counterculture to affirm their own values. And how can they move it? Through rejection. They reject those who are practicing countercultures. Hitler did that during Nazi Germany, di ba? Okay, so in order to threaten by counterculture, kasi dumadami na yung Jews eh, nagdo-dominate yung mga Hudyo dun sa government ng Germany dati, no? So Hitler would now reject them in order to reaffirm yung values daw ng German people. We also have culture and technology. Nasabi ko na din kanina. Hindi ko na din sasabihin. Although ito to. Sige, sabihin ko na. Technology refers to tools in its broadest sense. It includes the skills or procedures to make and use those new tools. So, lagi may nag-emerge na new technology because this is the time of modernity. So, nag-improve yan. Now, technology basically affects culture, and Ogburn identified three concepts. Now, for instance, we have the cultural lag. Refers to the situation in which not all parts of culture change at the same pace. So it's hard to state this one kasi papasok dito ethnocentrism, no? But for instance, sasabihin na natin, when it comes to technology na lang, Philippines will now be far too different when it comes to the technology of Japan. So nagkakaroon ng cultural lag. Kasi Japan, when you already check, ang tinitignan natin, highly technological yung nila, yung society nila. Now, when we talk about cultural diffusion, refers to the transmission of cultural characteristics. So slowly nagta-transmit dito sa Pilipinas yung culture ng Japan because of a lot of factors, no? Migration, trade policies, di ba? Cultural leveling is on the process in which cultures become similar to one another. So humahabol yung Pilipinas. Yan. And another example would now be South Korea. During your 1950s, napakababa ng South Korea, cultural lag. Now, South Korea also sent some of its individuals na ginawa din ng Japan to foreign countries. And South Korea also invited investors in order to focus on their export industry. So nangyari dito, nagkakaroon ng cultural diffusion, nagkakaroon ng transmission of cultural characteristics. They will learn the good points from other countries at nagkakaroon ng cultural leveling. So mahabol yung South Korea. Now, that is an example of how technology affects culture. Actually, ano lang yan, I recycled recycled my PowerPoint presentation. So basically, this is just a supplement, and I just recycled yung aking discussion way back in the senior high. Matagal ko na to hindi na-discuss kasi because of the new curriculum. And I changed my employer. So I hope guys may matututunan kayo. Then I'll be creating as well yung discussion natin or discussion natin, yes, in socialization. So thank you guys, and I hope you're having a good day. So always take care and stay healthy.